Um, well, this is really amazing to see you all here. It's just real. I feel funny with this microphone. Jess said it's working. It is working. I just have to hold it closer. Okay, really close. Well, I really want to thank all of you for coming. This is an amazing crowd to see here, and I feel like it's already been absolutely wonderful night because it's just good to see people that we haven't seen in a long time. And I know that some of you haven't seen each other in a long time or been to play school or even been to play school before. So welcome. This is just very, very special. And there's people here who even knew Betty and Oskar. So that's doubly meaningful. I want to thank Laura, who's not here tonight. She's homesick. She's been sick all week and wishes that she could be here, but for being the head of play school and saying yes to this event. And how about a big round of thanks and applause for Ashley, who did all of the food. And Maria, who's here, and Nikki, they teach in this room and it gets rearranged several times a week for everything. So thank you for letting us rearrange the room again. I also just want to briefly introduce who we're going to hear from. So Tina, Betty and Oskar's children, Tina, Wave, and Tasha, and Angie. And then we have other family members here. Michael Churchill, married to Tasha. My husband Bill is here. Daphne's husband Nate is here. Daphne's here, and our children. So we have a lot of family here. And then I want to introduce our two speakers today. We have Jim Garrison over here, who is a retired architect and an architectural historian who's kind of taken on, a big interest in Oskar and, of course, lives right nearby. So is becoming quite an expert on this whole area. So we're lucky to have you living right here and being part of these things. And Michael Tosti has come out from Philadelphia. He's a PhD candidate in the Weitzman School of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, and he has been delving deep into the archives in Wyoming of Oskar's work. So we're very fortunate to have him here. Okay, so you can go to the next slide. Often at Play School, we hear a lot about Betty, but the evening is a chance to learn more about Oskar Stonorov as well, and about the ideas and people that brought Play School to life. There is renewed interest in the work of Oskar, as having Jim and Michael and all of you here can attest to. And this is an opportunity to use Play School as a lens for viewing themes in his work. Next. I want to note that we are going to focus on the 1930s, basically Stonorov's early work through the time period of Play School in Avonlea, which is the name of their home. This is a time when he comes to the US from Europe, establishes a practice, gains very positive attention and media exposure for his projects, meets key figures in his life, including his wife, Betty, starts a family, and builds a home. It's a very busy 10 to 12 years. Next. So this time period is incredibly formative, but is obviously not the whole story of Oskar's life and work. Oskar was not just an architect. He was also a sculptor who loved spending time working in Italy. He was a political catalyst who pushed housing legislation. He was an ardent friend to labor unions and championed the civil rights movement. Next. And he was a loving husband and father who delighted in living on the farm in Avonlea and having Sunday lunches with the Kroll and Bacon families and any number of distinguished guests, such as Le Corbusier. So we are not going to be able to cover all aspects of his life here tonight, as it is quite multifaceted and rich. However, I also want to acknowledge the date that we are here. It was on this date in 1970 that Oskar, Walter and May Reuther, William Wolfman, who was Reuther's nephew and bodyguard, and the pilot were killed in a small plane crash. They were on their way to the Black Lake UAW Family Education Center in Michigan for a final site visit. As I learned more about Oskar and Walter's relationship and understand Black Lake as a project that was immensely meaningful and personal to both of them. It brings some small measure of grace and understanding, but this was not a one-off work trip. This was another piece in a long, long journey together. You will hear a good bit about unions this evening because Oskar had enduring relationship with organized labor and especially with Walter Reuther. They first met at a labor conference during the late 1930s, during this formative time that we're talking about, and first worked on a project together in 1941. Their families spent time together, and as you can see from this picture, they greatly enjoyed each other's company. The date that we scheduled this is just kind of happenstance, but it's also beautiful to all be together and to celebrate Oskar's lasting legacy, of which Play School is such a key piece. So why this history and architecture of Play School? I love learning about Oskar and Betty because they're my family, but why might the rest of you be interested? Play School is our shared hope of creating a better future. Any school is, and really any building is too. They are big investments that show what the educators and what the builders value. And Play School captures in its architecture certain foundational ideas that were important to Oskar and Betty in trying to build a better world. We can learn why these values were shared by many other progressive architects in education of this time who are committed to a more equitable and democratic future, and think about how we might manifest these today. These values include creativity and openness, connection to nature, the importance of play and social learning for a child, cooperative work, and a focus on the whole family and the value of community. This building is architecturally significant as an actual built example of modernism encapsulating these progressive ideals. Secondly, these are values which Betty and Oskar actually put into practice here at Play School. The ability to take ideas and connections and then put them into practice was a terrific skill that they both had. They made things happen. Thirdly, this building is also a stellar example of a global architectural style, modernism, being fully realized as an American regional style and as an individual architect with recognizable work. Oskar's ability to take a historic building and completely transform it with modernist forms and materials and yet not lose the character of the surrounding landscape and history is very, very special. So I hope that those are some of the things that you'll take away from in general from this evening. And then we're going to have, that was maybe a little too long of an introduction, but the other parts that we're going to hear about today are, next slide. So we're going to hear about Oskar in three parts. We're going to hear from Jim, European modernism comes to America. We're going to hear from Michael and Angie about the context of cooperatives and progressive artists in the 1930s. And I'm going to come back and say a little bit more about community and architecture at the Carl Mackley houses in Play School with some insights from Tasha as well. So we will switch over to Jim.
Got a cord to swing this thing on. Lloyd was saying how lucky everyone is to have me. I'm the lucky one. You know, not only do I have 2 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon, I have 1 degree of separation from Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier. And as an architect, that makes my life. You know, it's you can't imagine how somebody who grew up studying these figures, you know, from books and knowing people who might be 3 times removed, to come to a place where they stood, they looked at the landscape, they appreciated it, and they really shared a strong common bond with Oskar. And me as an architect and as a historian, one of the ways I learn about these things is immersing myself, in the landscape, in the atmosphere, and listening to what the buildings have to say to me. And so, you might think that, and probably most people here, modern architecture, oh, it's the 1950s red schoolhouse edition. Oh, it's, that lousy building, corporate office building. Oh, it's the bank branch somewhere. But modernism, in its pure sense, was a movement uh, mostly born in Europe, and European modernism in particular came about after the First World War. And the reason it's so important and its origins are so important is because it was an architecture of optimism. It was all about rebuilding, restructuring, and the power of architecture to not only rebuild cities, but nations and societies. So these original practitioners had a very strong social conscience, and their architecture, in a sense, was just the vessel that made these other things possible. So two of the real giants in the profession in Europe, representing the modern movement, and this is mostly on the continental Europe, not England or Ireland. Le Corbusier on the left, talking to Mies van der Rohe on the right. And how can you have like a picture of like two visions, personalities, Le Corbusier and Mies? Oh, Mies doesn't have a cigar in his mouth, but these were extraordinarily influential, powerful people. And one of the ways that they realized their ideas was through creating demonstration sites. And because post-war housing was so important to Europe, one of the most important projects was the Weissenhof in Stuttgart in 1927. Here's the list of architects. Here's a model, and it was actually built. And so not only did they write and talk about this, but they realized it in forms that would help people understand what it could do. And it really, the ideal landscape dominated by Mies's apartment block here, which we'll see another picture of later on. So Le Corbusier, born in Switzerland, his early pre-World War I architecture, somewhat traditional, came up through being a stonemason, working in a city that was dominated by watchmakers. But he combined that sense of working with natural materials with that Swiss precision and developed his strain of modern architecture, which in the early 20s went through a period called purism, everything very white and flat, but it gradually started incorporating more natural materials. And one of the beauties of it, and one of the strengths of it, was how well it could work at different scales. Here was a scheme for the League of Nations headquarters. This would have been the post-World War I UN on Lake Geneva in Switzerland. But this competition entry was not chosen. Something far more conservative and neoclassical went up in its place. But another building on Lake Geneva was built, and this is his house, his second house for his parents, right on Lake Geneva. I think you're starting to see, if you know the play school, some very similar ideas. Here's Le Corbusier in 1923 and 24, after he had almost bankrupted his parents with the first house. He comes back and designs a little 1,000-square-foot cottage on the lake. But within this 1,000 square feet, he sums up all of the qualities of this new architecture. This was a building that Oskar knew. I'm sure he saw it in reality. It was an important part of a book that he would do on Le Corbusier's work. And you just look at it and you see what came over from Europe to Charlestown. Oskar must have been one of the most amazing people ever. I tend to think of him as a catalyst. He was the kind of personality that when placed next to other strong personalities, he could almost outshine them, but he made them all look very good, and they appreciated that from him. So here, as a young, he didn't even finish architecture school, but he went into practice with a French architect, André Lassat. He gets to know Le Corbusier through Lassat, and in 1929 publishes the first volume of an 8-volume set on Corbu's work. There was probably only one other architect in the world who cared more about how his work was presented than Le Corbusier. And here's Oskar as a 25-year-old co-authoring the first volume of this set. So who was that other architect? Frank Lloyd Wright. Who else could ever coexist with personalities that strong and be both highly trusted, respected, and a true partner? So in 1929, when Oskar comes to the United States, this is what he brings. It did not exist here before that. Corbu had been in New York once, he kind of wrote it off. He liked the grain elevators up in Buffalo a lot more, but Oskar brought that flame. He joined a somewhat unlikely partner, Alfred Kastner, and Mike's going to talk about him a little bit more. But I love this picture. I think Tasha, you had this in a group up at your house. Oskar and Alfred in the mid-1930s, one of their housing projects, and something near and dear to every architect's heart. The biggest space they could afford, and sharing a desk. But I think this partnership was incredibly strong. Each person brought a different thing to it. Kastner with a real sensibility about how to get things done, and Oskar with a very grand vision. And this vision was soon realized in competition entries to, in the late 1920s and early 30s, there were a huge number of international architectural competitions. One of the most visible and important was the Palace of the Soviets for Joseph Stalin in Moscow. And in 1931, there was still enough openness that architects from the West could enter. First prize, Le Corbusier. Second prize, Alfred Kastner and Oskar Stonorov. Now, unfortunately, neither one was built. Stalin decided that this architecture was too radical. And in attempting to further cement his power and authority, he fell back on, just as Hitler did with Speer, a very severe neoclassicism. So neither of these made it, but on an international platform, Stonorov and Corbu. Coming back briefly to the Weissenhof in 1927, this great view, and this was a favorite conceit of many of the early modernists. The house as a machine for living, Corbu was quoted or misquoted saying, but he'd have his house, his White House, with a Voisin or a Citroen parked in front of it. Here, Mace has a Mercedes, and making the strong connection between the design of the car in the design of the building. If we look at the design of this building from 1927, and then the Carl Mackley houses begun in 32 and I guess finished in 34 in North Philadelphia, the similarities are not coincidental. So with the changing climate in Europe in the 1930s, there was really a mass exodus, especially from Germany. Mies comes over, goes to Chicago. Marcel Breuer and Walter Gropius go to Cambridge, to Harvard. And what's interesting about that whole group of emigres, they gravitate towards the universities, towards places of study. Oskar, though, had already been here since 1929. He was taking things in a different direction. But it's worth noting that this European modernism comes and lands in the United States in a couple of very discrete places and has some initial representations here. The housing development outside Pittsburgh for Alcoa, the competition entry by Breuer and Gropius for Wheaton College in Massachusetts. And you can see in both of these the very strong connections to that European architecture and where it got its foundations here. So that brings us to Oskar coming to Chester County, Charlestown. And he had met Betty at the Carl Mackley houses through the work with the labor union that was the client. And I think he really appreciated her strong feelings about organized labor and about a duty to provide fair housing, good housing, education, the benefits of modern industry to the worker. And so she was able to convince her father, Frank Foster, who had made a fortune with a Congolian company in synthetic flooring and rubber flooring. He came out to this corner of Chester County, bought 1,200 acres of property. I don't know how many farms it was, at least 5 or 6. By the time he bought these farms, many of them had kind of grown fallow, and he was able to reestablish some of the farming and was starting also to begin to commission new public schools, the Charlestown Consolidated School, Schuylkill Township, East Pikeland. So he was philanthropic, had a very broad mind. And so at his property at Broadwater Farm, an old farmhouse, Oskar was able to do his first big project as an architect in the United States. And so when we look at Broadwater Farm, and it was published the year after it was built, which was very unusual. A farmhouse with a modern addition, Oskar Stonorov, architect. And so you see here the original farmhouse. He starts to add on to it, keeping those same themes of the thick stone and then stone appearing here. But as he goes out to the ends, it all becomes thinner and whiter as you saw those are like if you go back one with them. This is the architecture of European modernism. And in keeping with the whole idea that like in Corbu's or Complete, all the illustrations were chosen very carefully to show this architecture as a living entity. So here we have Miss Betty on a Corbu chaise. Here she is sunning herself off the balcony. These pictures, this is how Americans came to know European modern architecture through Miss Betty. So that brings us up here to the play school. And in the 1920s, this great John Pierce painting shows the old Presbyterian church which the congregation had moved out of, and the Amity Schoolhouse here, which was replaced by the Consolidated School. So you had this really interesting parcel of ground with these buildings on it, right next to a Revolutionary War graveyard. And so Frank buys it. And Betty had already started a play group up at Broadwater Farm, but in 1938 and 39, Oskar takes this old stone building and it becomes the foundation for the play school. And he builds the school on top of it. And so you have this very modern building perched on the old stone walls. And you see here in 1940 from Architectural Forum, 2020, it's a well-preserved building. The forms are still here, the message that it carried about how the building sat in the landscape. But as with all buildings of its age, it has preservation issues, and modern architecture has a different set of issues than traditional. But we're incredibly lucky to have it here and to have it be as intact as it is. So here again from Architectural Forum, instead of doing simple plans like you saw for those other buildings, they show it as a cutaway. So it really shows how the building worked. And the whole idea of front and back, open and closed, it's the perfect diagram of what modern architecture was all about functionalism, about being the place where things could happen, but not putting limits on what those things were, and making the strong connection between outside and inside. The third piece that goes with the play school and Broadwater is Avonlea, down on the corner, right across the bridge on Pickering Creek. And the same builder, same year as the play school, Oskar was taking an old farmhouse and converting it for the use of his growing family. And so buried inside this is an 18th century farmhouse. But within those constraints, he develops this incredibly sophisticated, modern movement, modern house that still respects its landscape, but brings all those ideas from Le Corbusier from the modern house design right here. And not unintentionally at all, a big part of the plan on the uppermost floor is the playroom. So it's his studio, the playroom, and I'm sure the daughter who lived in the house maybe can tell us some things about that playroom, but just to finish up, I can't think, I've been practicing architecture for 45 years now. There is no place that has a better collection of modern architecture than Charlestown Township. I would defend that position to any academic, anybody from the government. What we have here, because of the architecture, the preservation of the land, the setting, and then the institutions, makes this collection world class. So if you two great pictures, Oskar looks a little tired there, but here were two architects. Began practice around 1910, mid-1920s. They're the jet age architects. These Air France, Alitalia, they got around. And so I think it's important to remember that this European modernism came with a lot of other ideas. And the architecture is great, I love it. But it's the whole package, and it's through people like these who are committed to good design being good for people.
Okay, try and set up here. Um, all right, so first of all, I want to thank everyone here. To Laura for first inviting me out here to the school, and to Allegra, Tasha, and Michael for being such amazing hosts, and for taking the time to speak with me about Oskar, Betty, Henry, Churchill, and the incredible and ongoing history of this community, and really what it represents. So my dissertation at large has to do with the politics and architecture of the 1930s in the US, the complexity of it, and a group of people within a field that at the time was famously either, let's say, authoritarianly technocratic engineers, technicians, or gentlemen who, just sit in rooms and smoke cigars and, make their commissions and everything like that. In that scene, there was a group who really saw the potential for design and architecture to improve people's lives, to be politically active, and to do so through the idea about having a ground up democratic society. And really it's social democratic, but this is really the commitment of this group. We go to the next page here, that more having to do with Oskar. This idea of saying out of the ivory tower. We'll get to that in a second. Just to start out with, I think it's fair to say that this building is a sort of monument, but perhaps better described as a living symbol of a community, lively, vibrant, that has endured over 90 years. The life of buildings, the life of the community, and this community was clearly important to Oskar as he designed and carefully modified the school in collaboration with the members of that community over the years. He constantly stressed that experts, especially architects, needed to come down from the ivory tower. That was the term that he always used. Get close to the ground so both they and their work would be bettered by this interaction, that their work would get closer to the desired outcome of a just and democratic society. It was through his collaborations with people, with other architects, with activists, workers, community members, experts, and artists, that his work developed. And his architecture became more and more reflective of some core ideals about community and place that I think carry on today. This philosophy, it's a philosophy in which art, architecture, culture, community, and life are intertwined, open-ended, and continuing processes defined by experimentation and imagination. And these last two words are something that Oskar would constantly use. Okay, so with that, I'd like to share a bit of what I learned about Oskar and the larger group of people that he was associated with in this movement. So we'll go to the next slide. Between 1929, the year when he first set foot in the US, and the election of Franklin Roosevelt, when Oskar was not yet 26 years old, he had quickly ingrained himself in a network of progressive political actors, despite the fact, yeah, well, that's okay. I would just say that this is the world that he came into, first of all. Europe was on the verge of falling apart in Germany. And in the US, the economy was falling apart. And as 1929 went all the way to 32 and to 33, we have massive unemployment. And in the field of architecture, this is something that also is kind of amazing for Oskar coming over when he did. The number got as high, this is one of the measurements in the US, that up to 90% of draftsmen and architects were out of work at this time by 1933. So this is the world that he's coming into. But as he does this, and if we go to the next slide here, he quickly ingratiated himself and ingrained himself in this network of progressive political actors, intellectuals, civil rights activists, avant-garde artists and designers, many of whom would go on to serve prominent roles during the New Deal and after the war as well. Among them were, I don't need to go through everybody, but Morris Cook, who was a good friend, the future head of the Rural Electrification Administration. There's going to be a lot of stuff like this. I'm going to skip through this. Fritz Guttheim, who was a real good friend of his and instrumental in developing the Tennessee Valley Authority. The feminist activist and economist Mary Dublin Kaiserling, as well as her future husband. And the soon-to-be Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, Clark Foreman, a white Southern civil rights advocate, and John Edelman, a labor leader, with his own sort of radical vision of what it could be in the US that I think Allegra will talk a bit more later. And then also J.W. Johnson, Grace Nail Johnson, and their father, prominent activists during the Harlem Renaissance. This is the people that he got in contact with at 26, right? 25, 26, in a couple of years, right? But this gets to his attitude. This is something from a sort of a tribute or a memorial issue of L'Architectura, a major architecture magazine in 1972 by Bruno Zevi, who was a friend of his, quoting Oskar. What then is this thing I'm talking about? Design is political action. Design is an arrangement of things. Politics is the interplay of interests within a city. Politics can be the lowest form of precinct corruption, as it can be the highest commitment to the community interest. However, choice, not only as a physical idea, but also as a deep and symbolic expression of the richness of the democratic process, choice of our productivity available in the marketplace becomes more than bread and circuses of political callousness. In other words, this is something he took very seriously, or at least was able to speak about it like he took it pretty seriously, I would say. So, yeah, if we go to the next slide. Okay, so to get back to this idea of the cooperative, this group used cooperative as a catchword to include consumer cooperatives, work cooperatives, land cooperatives, and as we will see, cooperative schools. We do see. The term suggested ideals of communitarian principles, while getting away from that thing Americans often don't like in state control, right? Often referencing the work of Henry George, if anybody's familiar with him. It was meant to avoid the use of the word socialist or collectivist. And this is as the Red Scare of the late 1910s and anti-Semitism and xenophobia loomed large in the country. To do this, it was important for them to show how cooperation was an American ideal, right? And there were two places that they really looked to, or a couple places in Europe. It was the Garden City movement and the arts and crafts movement and land labor movement in England. It was worker cooperatives in in the Nordic countries and the Netherlands. And then especially the New England village was always the thing that was sort of pointed out. They wanted to show this isn't a scary thing. This is something that we can do. In fact, it's a better version of what our society could be. Okay, we go to the next slide here. All right, so as I'll speak just briefly about this. In terms of his who he got himself involved with, one of them was John Edelman and Bill Jeans, and this is also where he met Betty as well, was through this project of going out and in 1932 doing a study and publishing a book of a study on these workers, right? And trying to figure out what he and Kastner, he did this with Kastner as well, called the felt needs of the people in the community. What resulted was something that was more about numbers and prices and who can afford what. But in the archive, there's this original survey that never seemed to have gone out that was asking questions like, if you could wake up tomorrow and not be married to your spouse, would you? Who is cranky in the morning? Who sits around the kitchen table? Do they read the newspaper? This is the level that this Kastner and Stonorov and Bill Jeans were sort of looking at how to create this architecture. This wasn't something that was meant to be on high, even though it's sort of drawn like that here. It was meant to be something that arose from people's needs. Okay. All right, and then the next slide. I'm going to spend just a couple minutes going over something that has really become central to my dissertation. This was simultaneous to him developing labor housing in the cities. He was also developing with the National Urban League. This is actually written by Kastner, but it's done by both of them. A system for a proposal for prefabricated off-the-shelf housing to be built by a community of African Americans outside of Richmond. That would basically the architect, and here I think Kastner inserts himself, will go there and give advice about the community or about how to lay out the community, and they'll do it together, and they'll have these sort of parts and put it together and build it together. And then at the end, you would have cooperative land ownership and cooperative, all of these things that were intended to be sort of alternatives to the kind of hostile world around them. And Kastner was really, this is something that he was really, really important to him and something he was really adept at, was noticing that the two things in the US that they wanted to deal with architecture with was the labor movement, something that they saw in Europe, and then also anti-Semitism in Europe as well. And then they made the equation, and Kastner does it explicitly, with Black Americans and what's going on with Black Americans. So this leads, if you go to the next, we'll just kind of go through these a little bit quickly. This is more of the plans for it. On the next slide, this is during the New Deal. The other stuff was before the New Deal. This program starts called the Subsistence Homestead Division. If you go to the next slide, these are some plans by Kastner and Stonorov of how to use the system of steel houses. If you go to the next slide, that they developed where two people could put together a house in a couple of hours, right? So they developed the system. They weren't the only ones working on this kind of stuff, but they were really involved in the how do you get this done? How do you make it happen through the bureaucracy with everything, right? If we go to the next slide, these are some prototypes that were built. The company, Republic Steel, decided at a certain point that basically that the government wasn't really a good client. The funding was unsure, so they built a few things for private consumption as well. And then there on the left is one of the that same image or that same model that the photo that Jim showed. If we go to the next slide, this wasn't in vain. They worked, Kastner and Stonorov, around 1933 with an African-American architect out of Howard University, who also had a very close familiarity, had done a tour of European housing as well, named Hilliard Robinson. And this led to they started working on this project together, and then it was decided that Robinson needed to work on this project as the lead architect. And this is Aberdeen Gardens, and we can go through a few of these in, we go to the next one, in Newport News or near Newport News, that it was really important. Basically, African-American contractors could not get contracts. African-American architects could not get commissions. So the idea here was that, it was really important. This was something that was championed. We don't have to get into it by Du Bois. It was a whole thing. It caused a lot. It was very complicated. It caused a lot of problems and rifts between people. But if we keep going, the point was that it was cooperatively owned land that would be farmed, and then would have cooperative shops with it. We go to the next. These aren't the modern houses that you're seeing. I'm not going to get into that. But if we go to the next slide too, another thing that comes out of this is the work of Kastner and Louis Kahn in Central Jersey for Jewish labor workers, garment workers, which is a similar thing. It was Albert Einstein was actually involved in it. If you go to the next slide, Another one of these communities was made, a cooperative community, with a farm, and then also, if we go to the next slide, a school building, with a large, painting, by, Ben Shahn, depicting the process of this, community coming together. And then the next, slide, as well as a cooperatively owned garment factory. This is in Central Heightstown, New Jersey. There was also the school? Yeah, the school's still there. Yeah, yeah. I don't know what state it's in, but I think there's been some restoration to it. Yeah. As you can see, it has a wood roof, which is, yeah. I don't think this building is still there though. But this was supposed to also be turned into a college called Babylon College. That was supposed to be a cooperative school in the country. And if we go to the next slide. Similarly, there were other programs throughout the country of building with Adobe. That this happened on the West Coast as well. All these cooperative farms, all these cooperative institutions where the workers and the community members would build it themselves at a time that everybody was out of work. The next slide. And then meanwhile, this is all part of the resettlement administration in the Department of the Interior. We have a more famous project, which is Greenbelt, Maryland. There were only a couple of these, or a few of them built, and then one other that Henry Churchill was involved in Central Jersey, that did not get built. All of this was politically very complicated. Any attempt for these not to be segregated was shot down immediately. And so as a result, all of this stuff was segregated. But that's another sort of story, as to why that happened. But here's another one, if we go to the next slide, where we have, cooperative, grocery store, and you can see here, the children having their own little mini co-op there. And you see those two trees, right? And we see this, these products. One thing that Oskar got involved in, as we go to, the next slide. We'll actually, maybe we'll skip over this because this is some of the labor stuff that was happening. This is also at Carl Mackley. So we'll just go through this really quick and move it. So Carl Mackley houses, in Philadelphia, another cooperatively owned through labor. This is the result of that earlier study. Where the plan changes. A lot of that is actually Kastner's really skeptical about European modernism. And this is a lot more similar to the sort of courtyard pattern. Is a lot more similar to worker cooperatives that had been built in the Bronx in the 1920s with this guy, Abraham Kazan. But we'll go to the next slide here. This is a quote from Oskar, and this is from something that he gave to a speech that he gave to the Nursery Education Convention in 1937. That he got a lot of he got commended for it a lot. To see fine architecture produced, we must begin not where the architectural magazines began, with the building itself, but with the whole complex motivations for life, out of which architecture eventually springs, and into which the finished building is finally set, whether it be a school, a house, a factory, or a city. So we have a cooperative school that's set up that, again, Allegra will speak a little bit more about. So I guess the next slide. And then spaces here where it was important that you'd be able to see your children, right? So this was really built around families. Next slide. And then here we see, and we'll talk about this some more, the cooperatives. That's Lenora Kastner was also involved in the founding of it, as was Betty, and the Edelmans as well, and the Jeans, is that right? And then there's a brochure from the nursery school. Go to the next page, and some other images. This is from the early 40s, this brochure. And then the next page, the next image. And then here we're back to the co-ops, these consumer co-ops. It was really important, even though this was planned from the beginning. Jeans and Stonorov at the very beginning were talking about how this was, we're going to have co-ops here. We're going to have co-ops here. When the press shows up, this is in the Hosiery Worker, which was actually had some really important writing in it, about housing and about sort of democratic involvement and things like that. So they're trying to say, oh, these people did it themselves, right? This was very important to them, right? And they didn't really push it, but they were like, this was all part of the plan. We have the tenants set up a cooperative store, credit union, we have the nursery school. And while this is going on, something that I've just kind of gotten into in my research is that Oskar is trying to start an architecture service for the Cooperative League of the US. And this is about 1938, 39. To design buildings, and we saw those cans that say co-op on the side of it. There was already a design service that existed. That's modeled after an existing institution in Sweden. And we saw those houses before. If we go to the next slide. Okay. So meanwhile, while this is going on, I know I'm going over time here, so we'll try and go through this. Meanwhile, there's this thing that Stonorov talked about, art in action, right? This is a giant mural done by Marion and Grace Greenwood at the Camden Acres housing project in New Jersey. I'm sorry, Westfield Acres in Camden, New Jersey. And this is something that this and the other murals by the Greenwood sisters is something that Oskar fought tooth and nail to get. And if you go to the next slide here at an up close, you can see there's Oskar there. And Petal, one of his partners on the project, and then we have the story of everything being built. And if we go to the next slide, he also this is an early maquette from Isamu Noguchi. This was supposed to be at the hosiery workers housing. And then there's Marion Greenwood working on, actually that's at Red Hook houses. There's not many images of the Westfield Acres because it's demolished. But the whole point is that Oskar saw this as integral art, and especially art that spoke to people, that spoke to working people, or to as broad of a section of society as he could. He believed that that should be in his buildings, right? And that should be part of the program of his buildings. These were WPA projects, right? If you're familiar with this, but they weren't perfunctory. They weren't just because they have the WPA. This was something that he really believed in and pushed for, and offered, whether or not he was serious, to pay their way to, to finish the projects. He would offer it when the government would say we're out of money. Okay, so we'll just kind of, I know we're way over time here. If we go to the next couple of slides here, this is Camden Acres in, I'm sorry, Westfield Acres in Camden. This is another union for ship workers. It's a segregated white project. It was kind of a mess, but this experience, and this is roughly 1937, 1938, leads him in the next slide here into this sort of world of this group that I'm really interested in this moment at which they get around this idea that people, if given the right materials, can make their own communities, can do their own thing, that we don't need to be top down. And if you go to the next image there, these are some writings from the left who are from that issue. And you can see Oskar's hand title down there, In Housing, in which he rails against the bureaucracy that's killing all of these projects, and that the unions, that we need to have more experimentation and imagination in our projects. We need art, we need community spaces. We see calls for not having paternalism in public housing. All these things that we associate with American public housing, the point here is that it didn't have to be that way. This is part of the whole point of this. All these things didn't have to be that way, and there were people yelling about it. And then just to keep moving, simultaneously, he's also getting involved in other schools. This is when he's starting to work on Playhouse. And obviously through Betty's influence, he's beginning to understand sort of ideas about children and education. And this is something that he designed with George Howe and built for the 39 World's Fair. It's called Children's World. And some of it is kind of, like a maquette Disneyland and carnival rides. And then we have this very sort of sophisticated modern building there on the side. And the point there is that he's, suddenly becomes really involved and interested in this idea of education. If we go to the next slide, and you're going to cover this as well, Allegra, is some of the original drawings, or really some of the drawings we know of the site here. And then the next slide again, and then we'll go to the next one. And I'll just end with this because I know Allegra, we don't get a lot of people. This is from a 1972 article in Architecture Forum. The late Oskar Stonorov designed the Charlestown Playhouse in 1937 using the bearing walls of an old church. Mrs. Stonorov still runs the Playhouse, a private nursery school, which has always had close ties to its community. The location is a large wooded hillside north of Philadelphia. Over the years, Mr. Stonorov designed additions, always clear and simple and full of light. But in 1964, Mr. Stonorov, writing about the Playhouse, said, "I'm sure that the architectural form of a nursery school has not yet been developed. Such a building must have the ability for improvisation to a degree non-existent today. Various age groups from 2 to 5 might be housed in spaces which have different scales. The Playhouse does contain a wide variety of spaces, from a 2-story glass-walled central room to small rooms which cantilever out from the second level right above. There it is. It is at ease with its surroundings and informal inside without being dull." And then on the next page, I'll end, and this is, I believe Angie's gonna speak next. Is that right, or like,
Angie.
Angie? Yeah, so this idea of improvisation and experimentation. This is from an address that he gives on the art teacher as a social force in the community in 1948. "I am of the opinion," and this is about a planning, one of those, you saw a picture of those little planning groups. This was something that existed around this time in Philadelphia and in New York, of having kids plan their neighborhoods, do neighborhood planning. "I am the opinion that in design, means and ends should be undistinguishable, and while means consume time and time is our life, we should during this time live well. This in itself is an argument for the morality in the experiment. An experimentation out of experience seems to me the essence of our present activity. You, as art teachers," and I think this is really to teachers in general, "are the forces in the community that give form to the young citizens' aspirations. Color and line are political. Color and line can also give form to the economic and human necessity, the creation of a better environment, the planning of worthwhile living neighborhoods. Your function as art teachers in the community is action, and the form that this function will take will destroy the dichotomy between the ideal and the practical, art and action as one. You as educators and artists can do that." So I'll leave it there, and yeah, so that's my. And Angie, if you're
I'm ready.
out of improvisation.
Out of, yes,
Yeah.
yes, thank you.
Yep.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. This is a little breather. This is very short. And I'm going to read it. Especially on this day, which Allegra talked about on May 9th. And certainly it has to do with experimentation and imagination, which you mentioned so many times. It's very special to be standing in this space created by my father and to hear and see all that has been shared. This space is really a creation of both of my parents, with the focus being play. I know it has deeply influenced my own children, play being I will put on my glasses. And I do love laughter. Okay, here we go. Play being at the forefront and all the many other graduates. Growing up in a safe space to play in community. And for me personally, play has been at the center of my professional life in the theater.
Thank you, Angie. Okay. All right, let's talk a little bit. Are going a little bit long, so yes, I will use the microphone. We are going a little bit long, so I apologize for that. I'll try to speed through a little bit and just touch on some high points. But also if anybody needs a seat in here, they're there. So next slide. I'm going to talk about the Carl Mackley houses a little bit and then how they feed into play schools. So the Carl Mackley was a worker who was killed in 1930, and I'm not going to be able to see what am I reading. So
I'll just look.
Yeah. So Carl Mackley houses are named for a striking worker, and his funeral was attended by tens of thousands of people. The union was able to mobilize this amount of people was the American Federation of Full-Fashion Hosiery Workers. And they had a broad vision for workers' rights and the quality of life. They had parties, dances, and sports leagues, and also a strong emphasis on grassroots progressive education. In the Roaring Twenties, the demand for stockings led to an influx of workers, money, and energy to this union. And then when the stock market crashed in 1929, the industry crashed too, and many workers lost their homes. And this is the union that then hired Stonorov and Kastner to design new worker housing. As Jim referenced earlier, Stonorov and Kastner were emigres from Europe who were working in New York when they took second prize in the architecture contest. Next slide. The prize got them fired from their respective firms, but also brought acclaim and funding for their new Philadelphia office. Oskar was drawn to Philadelphia by his friend Eleanor Davis, whose father sponsored Stonorov's citizenship. Stonorov found a congenial home in which his musical, artistic, and social talents were appreciated. He gained introductions to liberal Philadelphia society, including one to his future wife, Elizabeth Foster, at a World Affairs Council dinner, most likely at the Davis home in 1931. The other key introduction besides Betty was John Edelman. Gail Radford, a labor historian, explains that Edelman himself was no stranger to radical plans for social improvement. He grew up in a utopian commune and then returned to the United States to work at the Modern School, which was, quote, an anarchist-sponsored experiment in progressive education, where he and his wife, Kate, served as principals. By 1931, he is a well-connected union intellectual, campaign manager, and journalist. Emil Reeve, who's here on the right-hand side, was the union president. He was very intellectually sophisticated, according to Gail Radford, and he and Edelman were running for office on a platform that included housing funds, an end to discrimination based on race and gender, equal pay for women, universal access to birth control, universal and free healthcare and education, and pensions for elders, which are all things that I think we're still working on today. When Stonorov and Kastner came to Philadelphia, this is the kind of electric atmosphere that they came into. And it was juxtaposed with the visceral suffering from the Depression that Michael showed as well. So Stonorov, Kastner, and Edelman met frequently at Edelman's house, joined by William Jeans, who likely knew Davis and Elizabeth Foster from their social circles. Jeans later remembered the group discussing all kinds of European and American housing ideas and that no subject was off limits. He went on to become the first manager of the Mackley houses and lived on site for many years. This group prepared thoroughly in order to build support for social housing. Part of the group was a survey of 1,000 hosiery workers conducted by Jeans, and the person assisting him was no other than Betty. They built support for the project by sharing how new forms of housing could save money while providing middle-class amenities for families. But they also listened. Based on the survey, tennis courts were replaced by a pool, and building heights were dropped to 3 stories to help adults watch the children. Edelman's wife, Kate, contributed her own experiences as a social worker, former teacher, and active member of the college settlement and women's suffrage movements. Her work in the settlements dealt extensively with the needs of women and children, such as providing toddler play areas and health care. She later became a social worker for the U.S. Housing Authority, and by 1931, she and John had 3 small children, so she was well-versed professionally and personally with the challenges faced by mothers and children. So it was Kate that insisted that the nursery school be included in the Mackley houses. Jean said that the school was not in the original plans that he, Kastner, and Edelman, a bunch of men, drew up. When Kate first suggested it, the men resisted it because of the expense and administrative difficulties. But she persisted, And the architects added a rooftop play area with bathrooms, indoor and outdoor spaces. It was co-located with the laundry facility so that children could play safely while their mothers did laundry. The nursery school used an apartment on the ground level. It opened onto a communal green in the same block of buildings as the swimming pool, cooperative grocery store that we heard about, the community center and the manager's office. These community spaces were intended to add to the quality of life and to the neighborliness of the complex, but the aims really went further. Stonorov and others hoped that they would also lead to more economic and civic cooperation, new patterns of housing as a step to more peaceful and equitable patterns of work, leisure, and daily living. But it was the nursery school that was really the biggest factor in creating the shared experience. Explains Radford. She actually interviewed a lot of former residents. And she said that the nursery school was the one thing that really drew people into community participation. While some of the other activities, some people liked them because they were unionized and some people didn't like them, but the nursery school was really the thing that brought everybody together. And it did so in two ways. The director, Mildred Adams, was remarkable for her relationships with parents as well as children. And secondly, volunteer labor was always needed to help keep the school going. Mothers did laundry for the school and also, quote, organized dinners, put on bazaars, and staged entertainments to make money, which I think is very familiar to everybody who's sitting here. Paradoxically, says Radford, the school's continually precarious financial situation may have been one key to its success. To keep it going, all the mothers had to be involved. Radford writes that practically everyone she interviewed believed that the school had been the key to the cordial social atmosphere at the Mackley houses. And in Beale Jeans's words, it really set the tone. There's an inherent tension between the idea that quality spaces help create a better quality of life, or that people can create that quality of life by coming together and organizing themselves, no matter what the physical circumstances. At the Mackley houses, there were rooftop play areas, communal greens, and a pool, and the apartments were a step above what was expected. But it was the people, namely Jeans and Adams, who made the houses a social success. The Mackley houses were a huge professional success for Stonorov and Kastner, and a boost to unions as well, partly due to Catherine Bauer's work. While Bauer was touring European housing and would use those examples to inform future legislation, the Philadelphia group was enacting them on the ground. The Mackley houses were the first federally funded public housing project of Roosevelt's New Deal. And Stonorov was really the one that made this happen. So they were a very big deal. And they moved the idea of public housing forward because they were a built example. So just as that example of that Jim showed at the beginning of that development with all the different architects working on something in Switzerland, here was a built example of federally funded public housing, and it looked really good. So it was very important. And so over the next few years, kind of temporary New Deal programs became more permanent, and Stonorov really threw himself into supporting all these efforts, going down to Washington frequently and trying to pass legislation. So his work over the next many years would be filled with both innovative housing and closely associated with the unions. His friend Frederick Gutheim wrote that not architecture design alone, but political action and the labor education to achieve it were lessons that had been learned early in the Carl Mackley houses. Both Oskar and Betty would take these lessons forward, not building for building's sake, but in order to create communities where each person could reach their full potential in spaces that were designed to inspire and afford time for family, for leisure, and for education. Next slide. For most of the first year after construction of the Mackley houses, Betty had an apartment there and worked in the nursery school as an assistant for Mildred Adams. And Lenora Kastner was there as well. In 1936, Betty started a playgroup at her father's house in Charlestown. when Betty and Oskar were married in September of 1938, work commenced on high school. Betty was certainly influenced by Dewey's approach to education, as he would be considered the most well-known educational theorist at the time. She studied for a year at the Bank Street Teachers College in New York, which was part of Columbia, where Dewey taught and had been set up to train progressive teachers. She likely heard him lecture at the New School for Social Research and the Barnes Foundation, where she attended classes. She also had attended the Phoebe Anna Thorne School, which was one of the first schools using Dewey's progressive models of education. Dewey was a firm supporter of workers' rights, settlement and housing movements, and education. He viewed democracy and education as related enterprises built on participation. And we see the importance of participation here at Play School. Some of the other 3 points from Dewey to Betty is the emphasis on real materials and the importance of self-directed play as a way of learning the skills that one needs as an adult. Play is the way that children acquire knowledge and skills for the subsequent stages of their lives. The centrality of the woodshop in the plan that we're going to see in a little bit is indicative of this influence. And here's Betty kind of cooking with children in the early days. Psychoanalyst Erik Erikson and psychologist Lawrence Frank, this is Erik Erikson here, were childhood friends of Oskar's, and their theories of child development were very influential on both Betty and Oskar. Erikson and Frank both emphasized understanding the development of children as rooted in the social expectations and relationships, and the importance of creating educational environments that promoted a healthy psychology. In the most simplistic terms, they were early advocates for social emotional learning. Their lifelong friendships reinforced the importance of social experiences for both learning environments and for built environments. Next slide. Crucially, socialization and learning are meant to be collaborative. Go back to Claudia. A collaborative exchange between teacher and student, and the idea of cooperation extends to the organization of the school itself. I just learned a lot more about that from Michael, so thank you. Play School was expressly conceived as a cooperative and a place to educate, quote, future citizens who, in Betty's words, will take their place in our democracy. The parents are involved in fundraising efforts, but more importantly, they help in the classroom and learn alongside the teachers and students. Learning to navigate social relationships and being a participatory citizen in the group, whether it's a group of kindergartners or parents or sale committee, were seen as the key to creating a better society. In 1937, Oskar addressed the National Association of Nursery Educators and said, "The need for education in human relations, the new relationship of the family to the community, calls for a new architecture, which emphasizes the cooperative characteristics of our way of living." So when Play School became available for creating this new school, they had, obviously all of these ideas. The reconstruction of this church that we are sitting in right now into a light-filled school was the outward expression of both Oskar and Betty's work in creating these new structures of societies, new forms of architecture and living. As we went over before, this was originally a Presbyterian church, and the foundation walls of the current building are from 1826. Around 1842, a one-room schoolhouse called the Amity School was built in that part of the play yard, and it educated hundreds of students here. That school closed in 1925 with the new consolidated school. You can keep it on, anywhere, any of these. When work started in November of 1938, Oskar utilized these big stone walls, right behind you can see, on the north and south sides of the original church. They are tall walls towering overhead. He replaced the eastern side with a double height of windows and tied the structure together with 5 visible steel girders running the length of the building across the ceiling this way. Drama was added through the soaring height of the main space and windows, and a spark of playfulness and children's skill was added back in with the slide and the fireman's pole. This plan shows 3 wide open play spaces, including one where the upper bathrooms and hallway were later carved out. And there's 1 additional room on the first floor. Next slide. Which was originally a very Dewey-esque carpentry shop for a total of 4 rooms. And that's where we had our food today, was the original carpentry shop that you can see over there in the first floor plan. And we are, obviously in this big community room. Madeline's asking if the school was originally mixed age and all together, and I am not sure of that answer. Anybody know?
Not divided up by age, was it all placed together?
I don't know. Anyway, so something for us to figure out. The windows that are looking to the east are hopeful and invite curiosity about the world outside. They connect the secure inside world to the ever-changing landscape. Next slide. And Oskar was vitally interested in how the teachers, students, and community use the space. Just as he has responded to the survey of the hosiery workers, he responded at the Playhouse to what he saw. First, being at Betty's father's house, and then throughout the life of the school here. At Broadwater, there was a great big room there that they used for square dances and all kinds of activities. And so he knew that a large open spaces were necessary for playing and for bringing community together. The main space at the play school is therefore not just a classroom, but as architectural form noted in 1940, it's a community room with features like a pass-through serving window over there, where those little rainbows are right now, that actually opens up into the kitchen. And so this main space promoted maximum participation in the community. Next slide. When he planned additions to the space in 1946, he continued to listen and observe. An addition is planned, a room to be enlarged. Oskar designs the structure after observing the children, discussing needs with the teacher, and making the outdoor environment one with the classroom, wrote Joan Hasselquist. And here we'll talk about the yard for 1 second. The play yard has always been an important part of play school. It is a place where the children can play in the sand, build with sticks and stones, and find bugs. Again, the emphasis on real materials and open exploration harkens back to Dewey's emphasis. Oskar put emphasis on the yard with a good portion of his original plan devoted to the landscape. It shows a path connecting the old Amity School, now deemed a skating rink, and here's a picture of people roller skating on it, to the building. It also shows a sandbox, a carousel, a gym, slide, and the large oak tree. Next slide. The new additions that he did in 1964 keep to orthogonal lines while contrasting textures with the older portions of the building. The shape of the additions are bold and simple, bringing to mind children's building blocks. The result is both ordered and invigorating, which is fitting for a learning environment such as this. A joyous sense of space, natural things lead into a gentle organization, bringing peace and excitement, delight and strength. The steep little climb up to the playhouse, the big tree and the great window before it, all these are not happenstance, but the deep reflection of the vision and drama of play school and a good world, which Oskar articulated for us. And that was a reflection by Ruth Bacon. So I'm going to leave that there and turn it over to Mom to see what she can add about her memories of play school and Oskar.
Mine is very short. Give me a minute. No. First of all, I have to see the other part. Take a deep breath. I have titled my remarks, What I Remember, What I Was Told, and What I Suppose. This is about the love affair of two people and their caring and sharing of ideas, ideals, thoughts, friends, and how they welcome people into their creation. High school is that mesh of daddy's artistry and mother's artistry, neither better than the other, but each striving to make ideas take form in a physical sense so they could be used and felt by individuals and the community, and where their underlying ideals could be realized. A creation is never the work of one person, but rather the accumulation of experiences and ideas a person has been exposed to. So it was with Mother, fondly known as Miss Betty. Betty was the second child and oldest girl of Edith Flanagan and Frank B. Foster. Her mother was a suffragette and writer, whose topics as early as 1899 included the importance of women's rights, play, and education. Betty herself attended the Phoebe Anna Thorne School on the grounds of Bryn Mawr College as a child. It was one of the most progressive schools in the country, founded on the ideas of John Dewey and closely tied to the women's rights movement. Of interest today, all classes were held outside, and children had specially designed snowsuits. I took Mother to a reunion of that other class that she was with, and everybody was about 96. They were all healthy, had no chilblains, no frostbite. Wonderful women. Betty's father was a self-made, successful businessman with a strong devotion to the public good and education. He funded construction of 3 local elementary schools, Charlestown, East Pipeline, and Schuylkill, and arranged for local school children to visit Washington, New York, and Philadelphia. Students vividly recounted these trips to me almost 50 years later. So it was not a surprise that Betty was very involved with architectural and civic projects, educational and civic projects, knowing that her father would support her endeavors. Play school actually started at Broadwater, her parents' house and property over the hill from here, directly over that hill, in 1936, as a play group for older children during the summer, after school, and on Saturdays. That is where Miss Carol Nesky, who was in this room for about 40 years, first encountered Mother when she came to a play group on the Saturday. She's 15. As more children from the community heard about what was going on, it grew larger. Betty had no idea how this play group would grow into a school, or how the school would expand in size and add a day camp. It was a step-by-step process, and each step seeking a new solution. By the time Betty started the play group that would become Play School, she already had important experiences which shaped her interests and views. I just wanted to say that I read today that day camp was started because my sister Tina asked her mother to make it happen. By the time Betty started at play group, Betty had been exposed to the ideas of John Dewey first when she attended the Phoebe Anna Thorne School as a child, and then later when she attended the Bank Street School and the New School for Social Research in New York. She also studied with Albert Barnes, who was friends with and greatly influenced by Dewey. So by the time Betty met Oskar in 1931, she was familiar with progressive ideas in education. Then came friendships with Oskar's oldest friends, Eric Erickson, and Dr. Peter Blose and Larry K. Frank. And as you heard earlier from Allegra, Betty had extensive experiences of Carl Macklin. When her marriage to Oskar and the acquisition of the church, with the marriage to Oskar and the acquisition of the church, her ideas and his came together. The important thing about placement is how the physical world of design interacts with the ideas of community and how people learn. When Daddy moved the school to the church, he kept some of the original design feelings and elements that bring history and connection. 2 walls and footprint of the Amity School are there in the backyard today. And to the new school, he bought an original room from the school, or one that was kept here from the church and can be seen upon entering the building. You can see it above the lizard cage, and when you're looking out, you can see it right there. It's covered with wires, so it's a little hard to see. The huge slab of rock, which is at the front door in that side, comes from the entrance of the Amity School. When Play School was being built, Mother had 3 ideas she told me about concerning the interior. The big slide and the fireman's pole were her ideas. Daddy designed the slightly hilly slide and painted a wide stripe down the wall following the curves, adding a colorful dimension. Oh, I'm not going. Now they're too far along. Her other important idea was that bathrooms should be happy places. The 2 bathrooms had windows, bright lights, and doors that usually stayed open. So, how did the architecture support the philosophy of the school, or the school the philosophy of the architect? This is how I responded to that thought. Let the sun shine in. Banks of windows. Morning sun in the 2's room. Windows and air. Let the winds blow through the school. Look out of those windows all year long and see the seasons change. The sills were low so that young children could see out and wide enough to sit on.
I don't have to.
Okay.
Oh, I couldn't find it.
Okay, doesn't matter. Light, air, and circulation were a huge factor in Daddy's architecture. I think his ideas derived a lot from his working with his friend Peter Bloss's father, who was a doctor in Germany, who believed in fresh air as a necessary design element in healing and health. Hence the use of the Dutch door, the front door, which could provide cross-ventilation while keeping children safely inside. The large room where we're standing was for full body movement, building with large blocks, dance, and as a space for community activities such as the art show, bazaar, Halloween parties, film society showings, Charlestown Historical Society meetings, and much more. The building was in constant use by the larger community. A church group met in the 2's room for Sunday mornings. Wonderful square dances were held here with live music and a caller. This big room could accommodate the needs of the community, whether it was a card party or a dance. It was a close connection between the school and what the larger community needed or wanted, and it brought people together. This was a very deliberate decision by Daddy to change this, to design the space this way. I remember Daddy telling me some of the other thoughts about his design. A welcome front door that was latched to stay open at arrival time. There's no barrier. A person entered the school and there was no barrier or door blocking the large room and windows. It invited you in. Daddy said he felt it necessary that children could see their parents at work on their helper day at school, whether they were going outside with a group or taking a child to the workbench. There were no upstairs bathrooms originally, so everyone had to come down the stairs and use the bathroom as well as the kitchen. The juice was cold. There was constant interactions and sightings. We also thought it was important that different ages and siblings could see each other during the day or come for a visit to another room. This way, a culture was shared. The play yard has continually been a work in progress and has changed as the school grew. Many artists added their work to the yard. David Parsons was one of the first. He built a giraffe that turned on a pivot and held 4 or 5 children, must have been 15 feet high. Paul Hogan was another artist who was a driving force in playground design, bringing a sense of the adventure playground and children building their own environment. Rocks were moved from the woods to the edge of the bike yard to create a climbing experience. They also lent themselves for use as a gas station or whatever else the children imagined. The original path from the Amity School to the church was kept in Daddy's landscape plan and later became the midway for events or the superhighway for the bikers. It is now the main entryway to the school. Play school not only had enormous influence on the children who attended and their families, but also was intended on the wider Charlestown community. But its design and educational practices have also had a wider impact, reflected in the widespread architectural reporting of the building and the continuing visits by educators and artists who have come to see and observe what we are so fortunate to use every day, including Eric Erickson, students of education from Westchester and Philadelphia, and leaders of early childhood education like Millie Bird and Barbara Pressman, who are here tonight, and Mary Lou Heisen, who became the national director of the VAC, which is Education for the Young Child in Washington. What is so wonderful is the 2 people who designed and started this wonderful place have left their ideas about children, beauty, education, communities, cooperation, dance, music, friendship, nature, plants, farms, holidays, responsibility, work, and democracy for all of us who use this building. Every new parent at Play School brings something special, a feeling, a skill, an insight that will become part of its ongoing life. Hopefully, Play School will continue to be a place where all this can continue to flourish and nurture many lives to come. Thank you all for coming and listening to stories about my father and mother. This gathering has been the work of my wonderful daughter, Allegra, who has spent countless hours gathering, filtering tons of information, photographs, testimonials, and then bringing together Jim, Michael, Angie, and me. It is no mean feat to condense 97 years of Betty's life and do it in Oscar's 65 years. There's so much material out there, written, sculpted, photographed, and built, attesting to the lives of these 2 people and all their families, friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. I thank you, Allegra, Jim, Michael, and Angie for bringing us a snippet of their lives around Play School. Long may it inspire us. And finally, a very loving thank you to my editors and typists, Allegra and my husband, Michael. Who knew what I was trying to say? Oh, what fun, what fun. And here we all are.
We should turn on some lights, but thank you all for coming. I think it's late, going a little bit over, it's 8:30, but if anybody does have questions, if people want to go, feel free, but if people do have questions and want to discuss anything,